Hi, I'm Valerie Kramer with NBH Bank. We're here today to talk about cyber insurance and security and how it can impact you and protect you. I've got three great panelists with us today.
Hi, I'm Tom Callahan. I am the Director of Operations overseeing our Managed Detection and Response division here at ControlScan. And my team is responsible for protecting our customers and all their cybersecurity landscapes in their companies.
Good morning. Oliver Sowards with Lockton Affinity. I'm a program executive there. I've been with Lockton Affinity for 6 years. I've been working in insurance marketing and sales for the last 20. And I currently oversee our e-commerce and cyber liability programs for Lockton Affinity.
Yeah, my name is Tomu Johnson. I'm an attorney at Parsons Behle and Latimer. I have served in other different capacities in the privacy field as the Senior Vice President of Privacy for a large global call center organization that operated out of 76 countries and had a workforce of about 220,000 employees. I've seen privacy in every jurisdiction on the planet and helped organizations, both small and large, create privacy programs that address the myriad of privacy issues all over the globe.
I think it's nice to tee up what is cybersecurity and what does that mean to me? We've got so many different types of companies and industries out there and they want to know how it's applicable to them. So Tom, how would you answer that question?
Sure. So cybersecurity is really looking at an organization's assets, their digital assets, their computers, their data sets, all that kind of stuff. And everything is really headed towards that digital landscape now. And it's really the how you protect that data, how you protect those assets, as an organization, because they are assets, they do have financial value. And a lot of times, some of that data and those systems have even more financial value to an adversary or an attacker than they would to your organization as a whole. So when you look at cybersecurity, it's really that collection of system assets, data, and even the intellectual properties as well that you may have as a company.
You hear a lot about pre-breach and post-breach. What does that really mean in your world, Tom, and then in your world, Tomu? How does that, when a client comes to you and they've had a breach, you always hear pre-post, what does that necessarily mean to just the general public?
Sure. So pre-breach is really looking at how you're protecting yourself before there's an incident. And the reality is the definition of before an incident, a lot of people say, oh, well, I don't get attacked or, people aren't coming for me, things like that. But the reality is that if you are on the internet, if you're a company, if you have, digital assets, like I mentioned earlier, you always have a pre-breach scenario. So what you're looking at is pre-breach, how to protect yourselves, how to prevent the impact of any incident or any attack against you as an organization. And then what you're doing to both address that, your principles, your policies, your response plans, et cetera. When you get into the aspect of a post-breach scenario, that's when you've identified that an incident has occurred. Potentially a third party has gained access to your systems, your employees, your networks, things like that. And it's really the collection of processes, policies, your response plans, as I mentioned, that you're undertaking in that scenario now that you've identified that there has been an impact or an adversary entering into your systems, your network.
Yeah, and so from my perspective, from an attorney's perspective, one, I think it's important to kind of distinguish between cyber liability and privacy, because when we think about cybersecurity, and everything that Tom talks about, when we think about privacy, we're thinking about how we create policies, procedures, governance within the organization to address specific laws and legal requirements, because a lot of your obligation as an organization is going to be dictated to you by the different jurisdictions you operate out of and how those jurisdictions interpret what is personal information, what is processing, what is a data breach, and all of those different things are going to change your response, who you have to report to. So from a pre-breach perspective, we have to think about, okay, what are the sort of policies and procedures we need to protect our organization, to demonstrate that we took reasonable efforts to protect the information within our organization. And that includes things like, are we training people? Are we conducting data privacy impact assessments where we evaluate the privacy impact of a process, procedure, product, or anything that could affect either our employees, our customers, or the people that we do business with? It's going to look at our pre-breach incident response plans. It's going to look at whether we have a process for responding to privacy requests. There's just a lot that you have to do to demonstrate as an organization that you weren't asleep at the wheel. Then when we think about post-breach, there's an event that's occurred, and then from an attorney's perspective, what we're trying to do is figure out if there is an event that has occurred, is that event something that rises to the level of a breach? If it has risen to the level of a breach, what do we need to do under the law to make sure that we're satisfying those different legal obligations? So for example, if you have a breach here in the United States, there are 50 different states and all of them have their own separate data breach incident reporting guidelines. And they have guidelines for reporting to individuals, they have guidelines for reporting to different attorneys general. And so you have to go through very quickly, identify where the people who have been affected by the breach, where they live, and you have to start developing a response in each and every one of those different jurisdictions pursuant to those different legal obligations. And that can get tricky very quickly. It turns into a nightmare fast, because then we're talking about state level attorney regulators here, but then there's a whole other layer where if the breach is large enough, you have to get federal investigators involved, and you get people like the Department of Treasury, you get the FBI involved, and depending on the type of information involved, it can turn into a rapidly growing myriad of federal agencies who may be interested in your breach as well.
And just to add to that, you've got timelines that vary state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, as well as to the time periods you have to report and things like that. So those are great points.
Yeah, so Tomu, that's a lot of great information, but most of it I bet went right over some of our businesses' heads, And so that goes back to when you talk about the action that you need to take post or during a breach, right? Well, how is it impactful to you? I really think that, Oliver, talk to us about the insurance policies and why maybe something a little bit more than general liability is really what our companies and businesses, no matter the size and scope, no matter what they do, how it is important to them and how it could protect them from some of what Tomu is addressing here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, any business owner is going to carry insurance with them. Most likely it's something like a business owner's policy, right? So it's a package that includes general liability, includes protection for that business, and in some instances it will carry some cyber liability coverage. I think cyber, in the last few years, we've really seen it become a much more required type of insurance for some of these businesses, because your standard, general liability will help you with a slip and fall. Your business owner's policy will help you with other items as well, but it's not going to protect you in the event by a standalone standpoint as from that cyber attack. And so, having a cyber liability policy is really the only insurance that's going to protect you in one of these types of assets and the costs that are associated with one of these breaches.
And talk to me about, Tomu touched on it and then Tom kind of talked about it, but when you're attacked, depending on the state that you operate in or even may have associates in, how that impacts you and how you have to look at all the regulations and how the insurance piece can help cover, pick up where maybe they don't have the resources to be looking into that and how their insurance policy could really kick in for them.
Yeah, so I think, with a lot of these, there are costs that go across the board. And whether there is, a breach occurs, you have forensic analysis that needs to be done to see just how large the breach was, how many records were infected. You need to notify all of those customers that you have in your system whose records were susceptible to the breach. And then, there's always potential, costs from a legal standpoint, fines if you weren't doing what you were supposed to be doing to protect those records. And all of those costs add up. So you see with a lot of these businesses, I think anymore, one of the more misconceptions out there is, well, I'm not an online business. I don't do anything online. So why do I need to have any kind of cyber insurance? And the fact of the matter is that, all businesses nowadays use some form of technology to conduct their business. And therein lies the risk. You need to make sure that you have at least just even the most basic type of cybersecurity plan, which would be, front-end firewalls and other protections up front, but also the last line of defense is going to be a cyber liability policy, because at the end of the day, it's not if you experience a breach. It's when you experience a breach. And when you do, that cyber liability policy is what really is going to be what protects your assets and maybe the longevity of your business.
Yeah, Tom, he had mentioned something, it's not when, it's really if you get hacked. And I think you often have the misconception that, hey, I'm a small business, I don't do that many things online, I don't have that many employees, how does this benefit me or why do I need it? Talk to us about COVID, endpoints, all of these terminologies that kind of swirl around right now in the news and how that impacts all of us. And even as a small business, we need to be taking a look at that.
Sure. So it's, you touched on the, I'm a small business, nobody knows who I am, nobody's targeting me. And you might be correct, they're not targeting you specifically. But what you're seeing, and this was pre-COVID and it's gotten a lot worse since COVID. But what you're seeing is, we like to call them drive-by attacks. And what it is they just get, attackers will get a bulk set of email addresses. These are from previous data breaches. These are just from, scraping the internet for email addresses. Everybody's got their email address out there somewhere, whether it's corporate, whether it's personal, whatever. And what they do is they just send these, these phishing emails, these, various different types of attacks at all these email addresses. It's a scatter shot basically. And all it takes is 5% of a success rate on this. And if you think about 5% of 100 people that they email, and they email a lot more than 100 people, but a 5% rate, you got 5 people that get impacted. If you're looking at potentially $50,000 to $60,000 of ransom payments across those 5 people, those 100 emails for these guys were really worth it. That's a lot of money. So when you look at how even small business, even very small business, are impacted, they're just an email away from clicking on something that could potentially expose them through business email compromise, through malware, through any different types of ransomware, et cetera. So it's not so much the conversation about I'm not going to be targeted because of XYZ. That doesn't exist anymore. Everybody is a target, whether they like it or not. And that's just reality nowadays. Again, 90+% of breaches that we see or attacks that we see take place through business email compromise, phishing, things like that. So that's a heavy reality. When you look into the landscape now with COVID, you've now even made it worse, because where a lot of employees used to be behind secure networks inside of offices, areas where your company, your organization has invested heavily in protecting the 4 walls, as we like to say, that's now kind of gone, because you've got now employees who might be using personal computers at home to access company resources that haven't been hardened or protected in the same ways that a traditional corporate or company computer might. You've got what we call the FUD factor, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Everybody's going to be clicking on very targeted emails that are preying on humanity's need to know more information, what I can do next to make sure that as new press releases and stuff are coming out, I mean the attackers are preying on that behavior. So it's the industry and how the attackers have worked has shifted a little bit, but the reality is still the same in that you have to be diligent. And you have to stay protected, and nobody is safe. Nobody is immune from this.
You often hear, I hear it from my clients all the time. Well, I have firewalls, I have an IT group, I have all the antivirus software that I need. Why would I need to get any additional looks or peeks behind the curtain? How would you address something like that, especially in the environment where I consider COVID is a rapidly changing pace of how we operate and how our clients and our associates operate? We have more people being remote than ever. And when you talk about the phishing of the emails, right, there's a lot of clickbait.
Yeah, so firewalls work great when they're between you and the internet. In a lot of cases with mobile workforce, even with VPN, they're not anymore. So again, a lot of the stuff that companies have built in the past around the 4 walls of an office space or a building or a traditional network are kind of thrown out the window at this point. You've got a lot of even VPN configurations that are allowing, instead of all of your data going through those corporate firewalls, they've had to enact changes to be able to support a mobile workforce that doesn't send all the traffic. It only sends certain corporate traffic. So now you've got this kind of split paradigm where some traffic might be protected, some might not be protected. So that's really where you get into. You've got to, even with all the technology in the world, technology doesn't trump the human aspect, and that's really what gets attacked. And so with all of this, even with the best antivirus, things like that, we see time and time again that attackers still find ways in. They find ways to bypass the antivirus, the anti-malware. There's no silver bullet. If there was a silver bullet, I would have loved to have been the one that created it, because you'd be retired. But there is no silver bullet, and quite frankly, the adversaries in cybersecurity are always one step ahead, unfortunately, because the amount of money and resources they have versus what a traditional organization has isn't even comparable.
I've heard stories from companies out there just having basic conversations about, when, not if they get attacked. And they believe some of these attacks are so small that they can go ahead and pay whatever the ransomware is or whatever they're asking. Tomu, talk to me about, what recently, I think the U.S. Treasury came out and said, be aware of payments that you might be making that could put you in harm or even put you legally liable. I think we're talking about the OFAC list and OFAC sanctions. Talk to me about how any size business could be impacted by making the wrong payment.
Yeah, so, and depending on who you talk to, this is a very difficult decision. If you're talking to like the executive management of a company and, they've just been, hit by, a phishing attack that has turned into an attack that's progressed where all their files are starting to be encrypted and they can't get access to anything. The company immediately wants to get back up and running as fast as possible and wants to pay the money in order to get access to their files again. And that runs cross purposes with what the FBI, the Department of Defense, would encourage you to do. Instead, they have a strong position that they don't really want you to pay any of those hackers because all you're doing is funding giving them money in order to go after the next target. And you don't know where that money is going to. Like you said, the people that you're sending money to, they could be all over the globe, particularly in countries that sponsor terrorism. They could be in countries that are that are on the OFAC list, and you could be supporting those organizations by giving them money. And there's been a lot of when the FBI talks about this, they have a lot of maybe a schizophrenic position on when it comes to payment. I've talked to some field agents who will say, we're going to figure out a way that we can help you get your files back, and if that includes paying money, that's something that we can talk about. But then there are other hard stances depending on which field office you're dealing with who don't want you to ever pay any money at all, and that can be difficult for an organization because at the end of the day, the organization needs to go back, make money, and needs to figure out a way so it can conduct its business as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, the people who actually attack the company, it doesn't really, if you don't pay, they're going to make it so difficult for you that your business is going to crumble, and you're likely going to pay them one way or another, right? And so, at the end of the day, you can run into a lot of legal issues with the federal government when it comes to sponsoring, state-sponsored terrorism and other, or giving money to organizations that are on banned international lists, right? But, as a company, when I'm advising, the executive officers of a company when they've had a breach, right, the most important thing for us is not necessarily the legal liability associated with the federal government. They'll say a lot of stuff in order to scare us so that we don't pay people money. But I haven't seen too many actual legal cases where the federal government goes after a company that pays for getting access to their files back. And I mean, we're talking about cases that are under the $10-15 million threshold, right? And so we're not talking about very large cases when it comes to federal government marshaling resources in order to respond to this stuff. But for most data breaches, you're going to be so far underneath the radar of federal organizations that it just makes economic sense to pay and deal with the fallout of that, and trying to get your and trying to get your files back so you can get up and running again. And that's a business decision that I advise people with regard to the legal liability associated with paying these people. But at the end of the day, the business needs to make a business decision, and that's why they've either purchased cyber liability for this stuff, or they've got a reserve of money so that they can try to mitigate the consequences associated with having their files taken from them or locked up or encrypted.
Yeah, and if I can just add on to that, I mean, I think Tom was exactly right on those. I mean, and if you hear everything he's saying, he's talking about cost. How are you going to pay? These are things where the cyber liability policy comes in place, because otherwise you're paying out of pocket for those, and you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. The other point he touched on, which I think Tom touched on earlier, is that you're talking these businesses that have $10-15 million in revenue. Those are not making the papers, and so while you may see another Fortune 500 company get hit with a cyber breach this last week or something along those lines, you're not hearing about the small guys that are out there that are getting attacked on a regular basis, and those are the ones that are the most susceptible to a lot of these attacks. So have a cybersecurity plan, have a cyber liability policy if you want to go make sure you're protecting yourself and your business.
Yeah, just one thing to add to it's one thing to from a ransom standpoint to have the liability policies and to have all that kind of stuff to get your data back. The other thing to keep in mind through all of this is that we're seeing a large surge of what's called extortionware now, where it's not just the encryption of your files and actually getting access to your files back. These attackers are now taking those files. They're exfiltrating data from your organization, and whether you pay or not, they may come back for a second round. So when you are looking at your liability, make sure that you're looking beyond just the initial, get my files back, but you're looking at potential reputational damage, potential privacy issues. I mean, there's a lot more now, and it gets even more complicated as the kind of, the attackers are kind of enhancing what they're doing, I should say.
Whether this data point is old or moot, think about COVID, but I think I read 2019 Verizon data report saying somewhere between 43 and 47% of all cyber attacks is actually small business. When you start to think of the three levers that a small business needs, I don't want to be in the news. What's my financial obligation? And every day that I can't operate is revenue I lost. What kind of health check would you submit and recommend to them, Oliver, Tom, when you start thinking about insurance, when you start thinking about all of the tools that they have or resources behind their company? How often should they be looking at that information?
I mean, the reality is you've got to look at having, first of all, a cyber plan, which means that as an organization, you need to sit down and understand where you at, what's your maturity level. There's a bunch of different frameworks out there. I'm not going to recommend any one over the other because they can vary based on the type of business. But I can tell you one thing, if you don't have cyber liability policy, if you don't have insurance, or if you're not sure what your insurance is, go talk to your insurance carrier. Go sit down with them and understand, because there's underwriting that they're going to do that's going to require various different types of checks and balances and recurring, upkeep on a policy, things like that. So, I mean, that's, listen to your carrier, listen to who is providing you, basically, who's covering your butt when something happens. Because if you're not meeting those requirements at a bare minimum, then you're dead in the water anyway. You're not going to get the compensation that you need. So, Oliver, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think, first thing, you need to understand what you're wanting to protect, and that starts with devising that plan, right? What do you have that's at risk for your business, and so, are you protecting your records? Are you protecting your liability? Are you doing both? There are policies out there that do either or both. And for most businesses, I typically recommend a comprehensive, cyber liability policy that protects you for both of those types of risks, because the costs associated with those will vary, but they're both very, very high. And then second, you want to make sure that the policy you choose will provide you enough coverage in the event of an attack. This will largely be dependent on the number of records you have, the amount of revenue you are looking to protect. But be careful because be careful that the policy doesn't have any sublimits, okay? Because sublimits allow the insurance company to essentially provide lesser coverage on some of those more common types of cyber threats. Now, it may keep your premium down, but at the same point in time, you're essentially getting what you pay for. And the average cyber attack that we've seen, normally I think costs somewhere around $700,000 on average. And so, take that in consideration when you're thinking about just how much coverage you need. Third, make sure the coverage of the policy is expansive. Make sure that it's covering at minimum, expenses for incident response, network security, and privacy liability. Make sure that you've got cyber theft and social engineering covered, business interruption loss and business reputation loss. And lastly, as we touched on earlier, cyber extortion and ransomware. These are all items that you're going to potentially fall victim to in a cyber attack. You want to make sure that the policy you have is properly covering. And then lastly, with any type of insurance policy, make sure you're reading through the exclusions of the policy. It's obviously very important to understand what you're covered for, but it's also just important to understand what you're not covered for. So anymore, whether it's a business owner's policy you have or general liability, go and look at your policy today. Take a look at it. Ask your agent to do a review. Let them know what you're covered for, what you're not covered for. And if you don't have a cyber liability policy, make sure that you talk to your agent or feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, a big one when you talk about looking at the policy, a big one right now is the definition of what the covered assets are. With a lot of remote office and remote work, usage of personal devices may not be covered under your policy. So you really need to think about that. Even though you're accessing business resources from a personal device, if that personal device is the catalyst of a breach, your policy may not cover that because it is not considered, a covered device. So those are really important in times of COVID, so to say.
Given the environment, given the rapid change, that taking a look at it and trying to beef that up now and fill in any gaps given the change is a good idea.
I mean, I think I look at that as being, see how things are changing, see how your life is changing, see how the industry and the world is changing, and it's not something where it ever makes sense to wait until your policy is expiring to take a look at it. It's always good to do a reassurance as to what you're covered for, especially if you're, especially whether you're a business owner or homeowner. You want to make sure you have an understanding of what your coverage is, what the expansive of that is, and where your limitations and gaps are. And then you can make a decision on whether or not you want to do that now or do it later. But it's all assessing risk at the end of the day.
Tom, going back to you, tell us a little bit about the COVID environment and how that has changed cybersecurity and what we really want to tell people to be looking for to protect against. I mean, you had mentioned, personal devices with the remote working, but, what do we want to tell people to make sure that they're thinking about these things and then going after and having these conversations to ensure they're protected?
Well, I'll use the old adage of trust but verify. I mean, at the end of the day, just because an email or a communication of any kind looks like it comes from a trusted source, verify that it actually does. We're seeing most breach or incidents occurring out of some type of social communication. You've got phone calls from your IT department that aren't actually from your IT department. You've got emails from a plethora of different types. So really it comes down to understanding that as crazy as everything is right now, you still have to remain diligent and extra diligent, so to say. We highly recommend any company that's not currently doing some kind of security awareness training of any kind, start that process. It really, especially now that you don't have the ability to just walk to the side and talk to your help desk or whoever. We're all kind of sitting in offices or small offices or home offices. You really have to put even more onus on the employee to be diligent about what they're doing and to be able to make some decisions on their own, hopefully in a positive sense. So that's really been the huge part of what we've seen with COVID is not 100% relying on the fact that, IT's got me protected and XYZ. There's only so much that, the IT teams and the security teams can do. So the employees, as every day it gets more and more where the onus of the security of an organization lies on its employees directly. You can have the largest security team that you want. It still takes literally one left mouse click to take one machine, grant an attacker access, and then you've got about an hour or two on recent stuff that we've seen before your entire organization could be compromised. So it's fast. And another piece of it is 24/7. A lot of people think, oh, well, we're not in the office on the weekends, and we're not in the office on overnight, so everything's fine. That's not true. Look at what time zone you're in, and look at what time zone some of the most active countries are that do the attacking. They're vastly different. So we still see a lot of attacks occurring towards the end of the workday, around lunchtime. These adversaries, they think about how to best exploit what we're doing and how we act as a population. So those are big things to keep in mind.
And just to add on to that, I mean, I want to touch on something that Tom was mentioning. I mean, the employees. I think there's a misconception out there by business owners that that this is all some diabolical, well thought out scheme that these guys have to infiltrate their system and are using all this different technology. Whereas sometimes the simplest approach is the easiest and most powerful for them in breaching your databases. And it could be as simple as just calling up your business, speaking to an employee who you've misrepresented yourself or is it purposely to gain access to their system, and they're in. And we see this time and time again in the types of claims that we see come across. And it's not something that's highly technical. It's not something that's from the future. It literally is something as simple as a phone call a lot of times.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, you look at one that we see, again, it's not necessarily a breach by pure definition, but I'll tell you that as an insurance provider, you probably see it all the time. Things like funds transfers. You can go on LinkedIn and you can find out who all of the, everybody loves social media, so you can find out who the accountants are, who the CFO is, all that information. And you can do a slightly targeted attack. You can ask for funds transfers, and a lot of people with a sense of urgency are going to do it. A lot of insurance policies, if you're not sure what's covered there, do not cover that. So you need to be aware of that kind of attack as well. I mean, those are, you want to see a couple 100,000 go away real fast, there you go. And it's and that's not, that's not a piece of malware, that's not ransomware, that's not anything. That's just a quick, hit that can occur in seconds. If you're not careful. So it really is that diligence, again, and no antivirus software is going to stop that. That's not, like I said, it's not malware. That's just, it's a social attack. So all the pieces of software and firewalls and everything in the world are not going to stop something like that.
When you guys are all talking and you think about individually what you bring to the table from a cyber perspective and how you can protect a company, Tomu, hopefully we don't have to get to you, right? We're covered pre and post breach and we're not going to the courts. But if you were to give any advice, to a client or to a business, regardless of size, what type of services can you guys help protect them against? What can you deliver them to say, here's a tool for your tool belt, and I hope you don't have to use it, but here's what we offer.
Let me start out. I think I'm going to echo what I said earlier. Talk to your insurance agent. Get a cyber liability plan because they're going to get a lot of these resources for you. sorry to steal your thunder there, Oliver, but as an attorney, that's the most important thing that I can tell my clients.
This is good because we tell our clients all the time, get your insurance coverage.
Get an insurance policy. I promise Oliver's not paying me under the table to say this stuff. But the second thing I would say is if you don't have an incident response policy, or even if you do, go through and sit down with an attorney and take like an hour out of a day in order to run a tabletop exercise that simulates a breach. It doesn't need to be an actual external person coming through, but just run through your incident response plan with, just some quick facts about a potential breach scenario so that everybody understands what their role is, at what points are key decision points in the process, so that people know, all right, this is the very first part, we discover the incident, who am I supposed to call? Do we have the appropriate phone numbers, email addresses, and things like that in order to get the right people activated to respond to this breach? And then as we're going through and we're figuring out how we're going to respond to the breach and we're walking through our incident response plan, there are going to be key decision points like, when do we contact our insurance agent? At what point do we make a decision about notifying individuals or notifying government authorities about a data breach? At what point do we determine that this is an event versus an actual data breach? And those sort of decision points are good to figure out, good to do a trial run. I'll call it like a fire drill, right? It doesn't make sense to have a fire plan if nobody actually drills themselves on how to actually use the plan. Same thing with the incident response plan. You need to train, figure out, and run exercises with the plan so everybody understands what their roles are. So come time for an actual data breach event, you want to make sure that everybody knows what their responsibilities are, rather than cracking that thing open in the middle of a breach when everybody has set their hair on fire and everybody needs to have immediate action. You want people who are calm, people who have spent the time and understand what their roles are, how it's going to work, and walk through it so that this isn't the first time they've gone through their incident response plan in the midst of a breach. And doing that with an attorney is really helpful, because attorneys have one unique thing, and it's the attorney-client privilege. When you engage any attorney in order to help you with this stuff, we can protect it. We will assume that when we run this sort of exercise with your incident response plan, that it is pursuant to addressing a specific legal question. And when we do that, it makes all of all the paperwork that you generate out of running that incident response plan, it makes everything that, all the comments, all of the discoveries that we find, and all the weaknesses in our incident response process, all that stuff is protected by the attorney-client privilege, which means that nobody can discover it. Nobody can legally ask you for that information, and we keep it in a vault that essentially is impervious from either government inquiry or from individual inquiry in the middle of a lawsuit, which is sometimes the best thing a client can have, is that all the paperwork that discusses the weaknesses and the stuff that they weren't doing in the run-up to a data breach, having all that protected by the attorney-client privilege is incredibly powerful, because none of that can be heard by a jury.
Yeah, that goes back to what Tom was saying. When you think about the tabletop exercise, is a really good, just strategic thing to do for any size company. I mean, Tom, how would you kind of layer in what you guys would do for that tabletop exercise?
Sure. So my favorite thing to do with customers that we talk to, and when we talk about incident response plans, is pick a random employee in the organization and say, if you see a virus or something weird on your computer, who do you call? And if it starts with you failed, immediately you failed, because a lot of times there might be this amazing 30-page incident response policy, but the only one that's ever seen it is IT and the C-level. But guess what? The C-level, they're going to call IT, and IT is IT. What about everybody else in the company? They have no idea who to call. They don't know what phone numbers. They don't know what emails, who's the second person to call. They don't know anything. So when they see something, they don't know how to say something. They don't know who to say something to. And you have this, you could have a 2, 6, 12, 24-hour time span where an employee has identified an issue, but they can't get in contact with anybody. They don't know who to tell, and you've got this massive issue. So, the big thing for us when we look at it is, it's great that you have an incident response policy. Who knows about it? How are you reviewing it with your employees? How are you reviewing it with those who need to know this information? And how are you making that available to them? Is it part of your new hire onboarding? All that kind of stuff. It's great to have them. It's another thing for your employees to actually know about it. So that's a big one when we sit down and we talk through tabletops. Is I don't want a tabletop with the same people who wrote it. I want the tabletop with all the people that it could actually happen to. That's a big one. And then the other piece we look at in all of these, the incident response plans or anything, is, what levels of protection do you have in place to even, stop, prevent, detect, et cetera. The name of the game right now is prevention, detection, and then response. So when you look at the incident response policy, you really don't want to get to the deep, dark pieces of that response policy where you have to set up conference calls and you've got to, you prefer to stop it at the source, stop it before it actually creates an impact. So having expertise, tool sets, partners in place that can help you with that prevention detection component, that's a big piece of what we push forward as well. We get, within our services for our customers, we get a lot of hits a day. We've got full SOC teams that are doing this. And so we see things all day, every day that could have turned into full-blown breaches, ransomware, et cetera, that are stopped ahead of time, and instead they turn into a ticketing system, and that's it. We prefer that, as sure as many customers do. But just because you even have something like services from us or a third party, whoever, that doesn't mean you're immune. There is no silver bullet, so you still have to have the response plans and the organizational cohesion there.
And so Oliver, that he says silver bullet, and we've touched on that a couple of times. I know that we always hear that, but in your tabletop exercise, you said it well. It's never a good idea to wait until your insurance policy is about to expire. You should be reviewing that. What type of things would you ask them to review, and how can we encourage people to start doing that more early in the process?
Sure. So, speak to your agent. If you don't have a standalone cyber liability policy, you have a business owner's policy, see what your business owner's policy has. If you have a package, take a look at that and see what all coverages are included in that. Just see if there's cyber there. The the declaration page on those policies is a great place to start. That's going to list all the coverage that you have included in your policy. If you see they have cyber liability coverage included, great. That's a great start. But review it. See how high your limits are on there. See if you have any sublimits. See what the exclusions are on that. All of those are going to be information that are going to help you understand just how much coverage. If you have sublimits, it might be likely that those are some more types of exposures that you want to have a little bit higher limit for. If you've got exclusions that are saying that you're excluded for the types of devices that you're using, you need to think about how your business matches with the coverage that you're getting from a cyber standpoint. And I know that seems overly simple, and those policies can be very, very overwhelming, but listen, that's why you have an agent, and a lot of times, they're going to be able to answer a lot of those questions. And if not, we have a website, cyberlockdefense.com, that you're more than welcome to go to. You can call me and speak to me, and I'm happy to do a free review and look at your policy and see, what answers I have for you. At the end of the day, what we're seeing is that, everybody's insuring their business, right? They need to, essentially, right? And so, cyber is just another one of those types of policies, insurance that you need to insure your business, because, anymore, a cyber attack can be as detrimental and expensive to a business as a fire can. And a lot of times it happens more frequently.
Yeah, so I know, this topic, guys, we can go on for hours. It's in the news, it's in our face, we're trying to educate and help, the ones that we work with along with our clients. But, here's what I've learned today is you got to have insurance. You've got to have the right tools in place to protect you, because it's rarely a when, it's rarely an if, it's a when you get attacked. So if there was one piece of advice, a quick snippet, what would you tell people to do to protect them as they go forward in their business, regardless of the size that they are? They could be someone who flips burgers, they could be somebody who works online or remote. I want to make sure we cover everybody so they understand they need this.
Sure. So, the first part I mentioned before is, understand what it is you don't know. Understand the risks that you, as an organization, as a business, whether you're 5 employees or 5,000 or more, everybody has a risk associated with it, with their business, and understand what that financial piece of that risk is. And then, understand and talk to somebody who can help you kind of straighten that out. Understand what your best application of any kind of investment into services of cybersecurity would be. Buying an out-of-the-box solution that's marketed to a 5-person organization as the same to a 5,000-person organization, I'm sorry, but they're just not going to fit right. So you really need to sit down and talk to a knowledgeable entity who's going to be able to align and help you walk through. We call it a cybersecurity maturity model. Basically, it's how do you crawl, walk, run. You don't need to go and invest a tenth of your revenue to feel safe. There are alternatives on being able to cover your most vulnerable risks for the right price, and then over time continue to build and enhance that protection. So that for us, I mean, that's the big one we tend to focus on, is getting the right prevention, detection, et cetera, in place at the right cost for that organization, so they don't feel like they're giving up a large swath of their revenue to remain in business, so to say.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I mean, have that response plan, educate your employees, and talk to your agent. See what you have is from an insurance coverage standpoint. See if you have a cyber liability policy, and if you do, review it. Take a look at it. See what it is exactly you're covered for. See if that matches up with the business you're doing. See if that matches up with the way that you're managing your business. And if it doesn't, then it's probably time to look to upgrade that. But don't wait until the policy is set to expire to take a look at that now, to make sure that you're protected from this point forward.
And then from a legal perspective, I think the one thing that a company of any size, what they should do is do a privacy assessment with an attorney, where an attorney can sit down with you, look at your customers, your employees, and the state or country that you operate in, and determine what your legal requirements are for your organization. And a lot of times they can tell you, especially if you're in the United States, that you don't have a lot of legal obligations that you have to comply with. Usually they're going to lie on the data breach side rather than on the preventative side. But you want an attorney that can help walk you through that process, help you identify where your obligations are, so that you can address your legal obligations while also addressing, what both Tom and Oliver have talked about.
Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate your guys' time today. A lot of great and useful information, and we will be sure to share all of your contacts with those viewers today. So we appreciate it, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.